Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending my talk. It's an honor to again be speaking at Black Hat. So today I'm going to talk about my research on WPA2, and in particular how we managed to break the protocol. Now there's a small chance you already heard about this work under the name crack, but the research behind the Wi-Fi security that I've already been doing for a while has a bit of a history already, actually, because I've already studied the security of wireless networks during my PhD, and interestingly, a year ago when I defended my PhD, I got a question from a jury member, and he asked, hey, in your thesis you're suggesting the use of WPA2 with AES, but are you sure that's actually secure? And a year ago the answer I gave was, yeah, it seems to be secure. After all, it has been around for more than a decade, and there have been no real attacks against it. And on top of that, there are mathematical proofs that state that WPA2 is supposed to be secure. However, 1 year later, I was staring at some OpenBSD code, and I was specifically focusing on this function called ICSetKey. And this function basically instructs the driver into installing the negotiated encryption key. And without going into too much detail yet, I was thinking that, hey, what would happen if this function is called twice? Would the key be reinstalled? And what happens if this key is being reinstalled? And it turns out that answering this question led me to find this flaw in the WPA2 protocol. Or to put it differently, this talk is about how I gave the wrong answer during my PhD defense. So, to explain what happened wrong in the WPA2 protocol, I'm going to illustrate the attack when applied against the four-way handshake specifically. The attack also applies against other Wi-Fi handshakes, but I'm not going to discuss those because the idea behind the attack is essentially the same. And after that, I'm going to discuss the practical impact of the attack in practice, and I'm also going to discuss a few misconceptions that have been floating around the internet, and finally I will conclude the talk with a few lessons that we can learn from the research. So let's get started. Let's explain the attack against the four-way handshake. Now, the first thing I have to answer, what is the four-way handshake? And the four-way handshake is executed whenever a client wants to join a Wi-Fi network. And the purpose of the handshake is, on one hand, to verify that the client possesses the proper credentials. For example, for your home network, that the client knows the pre-shared key. And at the same time, this four-way handshake also negotiates a fresh session key, a fresh encryption key. And this encryption key is called the PTK. Now, as I mentioned, 1 year ago, I would have said that this looks secure, because there have been no attacks in more than a decade, at least if you ignore dictionary attacks. Because, of course, it's possible to guess the pre-shared key that is in use and then verify if your guess is correct. However, if you have a strong password, there are no known weaknesses in this handshake. And on top of that, the four-way handshake itself has been proven mathematically as secure, and the encryption protocol that is executed after the four-way handshake, that has also been proven as secure. So you would say that, okay, there is no possible attack against this. To explain the attack that I found, I'm now going to explain the four-way handshake in more detail. And to explain the attack, let's assume we have a client here on the left that wants to connect to the access point on the right. In order to start the four-way handshake, there needs to be some kind of shared secret between the client and the access point. Now, for your home router, that's very simple. This shared secret is essentially the pre-shared key. But if you have an enterprise network where you have to, for example, authenticate using a username and password, to obtain this shared secret between the client and the access point, first an 802.1x authentication phase takes place. Now, thankfully, we don't need to know the details about how this works. Basically, you can have this kind of authentication, which typically is some form of radius authentication, and the result of that is that there is now a shared secret between the client and the access point. And once we have the shared secret, the four-way handshake can be executed. So, as the name of this handshake implies, the four-way handshake consists of 4 messages, and the first 2, they are used to transport random numbers between both devices. So in particular, first the access point generates a random number called the access point nonce, or the A nonce, and that is transported to the client. In reaction to that, the client generates a random number, which is called the supplicant nonce, so the S nonce, and that is transported to the access point. And once both these devices know the random number, know the nonsense of each other, they can derive this fresh encryption key called the PTK. And the way that is done is basically you take the shared secret that these devices have and you mix them together with these random numbers, and the result is a unique session key. Now, one thing I want to clear up here before we continue the talk is that you might have heard about this work under a different title, namely key reinstallation attacks forcing nonce reuse in WPA2. I want to clarify that the nonce reuse does not refer to these two nonces right here. They do not refer to the A nonce or S nonce. So when I will be talking about nonce reuse, it's not about nonce reuse here during the four-way handshake, but during the encryption algorithm that we will see later. Okay, so let's assume we executed this first stage of the four-way handshake. Then, a bit simplified, the second stage basically confirms that both devices generated the same session key. So the access point sends message 3 to the client, and the client replies using message 4. And if that goes well, then both parties know that the handshake was successful, and they can install the encryption key to then encrypt data frames. So once we installed the key here, we can now start transmitting encrypted data frames. So the last thing that we now need to understand is how does encryption work in a WPA2 network once we have this session key. And let's take the following example. We want to send this plaintext data to the other client. What steps are now taken to encrypt it? Well, it's quite straightforward. We take the session key that we just negotiated, and we combine that with a packet number. And that packet number is incremented by 1 for every packet that is transmitted. And this packet number is also called the nonce. And the idea is that by combining the session key with this packet number that always increments by 1, is that you get a unique per packet key that should only be used once. And then this unique per packet key can be used to decrypt the plaintext we are trying to transmit. And here the encryption process is quite simple. What we do is we take the packet number, we feed it to a stream cipher, we get a key stream as output, and then, as is usually the case in a stream cipher, you simply XOR the plaintext on the key stream, and you end up with the encrypted data, the ciphertext. Now, of course, we prepend a header to this encrypted data so the receiver knows the packet number, the nonce, that was used during encryption. But basically, this is the process, and you don't need to know more to understand how the attack works. Now, the thing that is essential in this construction is that the packet number, the nonce, is never repeated. Because if this nonce is repeated, it means that the same per packet key is generated. And in turn, if the same per packet key is generated, this means the same key stream is used again. And this means you have key stream reuse. And whenever in an encryption protocol key stream is being reused, you are able to exploit that to decrypt certain packets. And depending on the specific encryption algorithm being used, that can in turn be abused to forge packets, but that depends on encryption algorithm. In general, if there is nonce reuse, if there is key stream reuse, you can start decrypting packets. So we want to be sure that this packet number is never reused. And I already mentioned for every packet that you transmit, it's incremented by 1. So now the only question is still that how is this packet number initialized? And the answer is here very simple. When you install the key, the packet number is initialized to 0. The nonce is initialized to 0. And this makes complete sense. You want a number that is only used once, so you initialize it to 0. For every packet you send, you increment it by 1. So you think, okay, this number will probably never be reused because, yeah, if the number would overflow, you would start a completely new handshake and generate new keys. However, we did find a way to force reuse of this nonce, and the way we did that is that we can force a reinstallation of the key, which will again initialize this nonce to 0. So how does that work? Well, let me explain the attack again with the following scenario. You have your client on the left that wants to connect to the access point on the right. And of course, we're going to assume that now there is an attacker between them. And the first step that the attacker needs to accomplish is that it needs to obtain a so-called channel-based man-in-the-middle attack. Now, what do I mean with that? What I mean with that is that basically the attacker clones the original access point on a different channel. For example, let's say that the original access point is on channel 6, and the access point now clones it on channel 1. Now, just to be clear, this man-in-the-middle position won't yet allow the attacker to decrypt any packets. It's simply going to forward packets. Because what it does, it will clone the access point on a different channel, and then the client will try to connect to this access point on this rogue channel. In this example, the client would try to connect to the network on channel 1, and the adversary, the man in the middle, will simply forward the frames that are sent on channel 1 to the channel 6, which is the real channel of the access point. Okay, so we can assume that the attacker has this man in the middle position. And this man in the middle position will allow the attacker to reliably block packets. Because if the attacker doesn't forward a packet between these two different channels, well, that's equivalent to blocking a packet from arriving at the destination. So what happens during the initial stage of the Wi-Fi handshake is that the attacker will simply forward any frames that are transmitted. In particular, the first 3 messages of the 4-way handshake, they are simply forwarded between both devices. However, once the client sends message 4 of the 4-way handshake, then the adversary will not forward that packet to the real access point, and it will block it from arriving. Now, what's interesting here is that if you look at this perspective from the client, then the 4-way handshake completed successfully. After all, it received message 3 of the handshake, and it replied using message 4, so it thinks that the handshake is complete, and it will now install the session key here at the bottom. However, if we continue with the handshake, then we observe that the access point did not receive message 4 yet. So according to the access point, the handshake hasn't completed yet. And it tries to recover from that by trying to retransmit message 3 of the handshake, because it assumes that this message probably did not arrive at the client, and that's why it didn't get a response. So the access point retransmits message 3, and in turn, the client accepts this message, and it replies using a new message 4. And interestingly, this message 4 here is encrypted at the link layer. And we will abuse this observation later on in the attack. Now, why is this handshake message suddenly encrypted at the link layer? Well, these handshake messages, they are essentially normal data frames. And well, we installed the encryption key, and this is a data frame. So of course, we're going to encrypt this data frame. Okay, so the client received this retransmitted message 3, and it replied using message 4, and the standard clearly states that whenever you receive a message 3 and replied using a message 4, you have to reinstall the session key. And this is where it goes wrong, because now it will again install the encryption key, and as a result of that, it will reset this packet number, this nonce, to 0. And what happens now, if the client sends a data frame, this data frame will again use a packet number of 1. In other words, if you look at these 2 encrypted data packets, the same nonce is used, which also means that the same key stream is being reused. So how can we now use this nonce reuse to decrypt contents of this data frame? Well, we're going to look back at these 2 message 4s that have been transmitted. And if you look at the first message 4, that was sent in plain text. And then the second message 4, which was a retransmission, that was sent in an encrypted way. And there's a small difference between these two frames, but most of the fields are the same. So essentially what we have is we have one version of the packet is sent as plain text, and one version of the packets is sent encrypted. So we simply XOR these two, and we get this key stream that corresponds to the nonce value of 1. And now that we have this key stream, well, we can simply XOR it with the packet that was just transmitted, and we get the decrypted plain text, and there we go. We have broken WPA2. So this explains the attack against the four-way handshake. Now, other Wi-Fi handshakes are vulnerable to similar attacks. For example, you also have the group key handshake, where we can apply a similar attack. We also have the FT handshake. The FT handshake is used when you roam from one access point to another access point of the same network. And you also have the peer key handshake, which is used when two client devices are directly communicating with each other. Now, I'm not going to explain these in detail. If you want to know all the details, I'm going to refer you to our academic paper, where it's explained very clearly. Okay, so we now know how to execute the attack against the four-way handshake, and we know that we can decrypt packets. But what exactly is the impact in practice? And the first thing I want to mention is the general impact of a key reinstallation attack. So let's say that we have a device that is vulnerable to a key reinstallation attack. For example, this can be an access point, or it can also be a client. A client means a smartphone, a laptop, or maybe a toaster if it supports Wi-Fi. That's also possible these days. And if your device is vulnerable, as I just explained, the first thing that is possible, if when it sends encrypted data frames, then we can force nonce reuse, which in turn can be used to decrypt packets sent by the device under attack. But there's also a second attack that you can perform. And the other thing you can do is that you can replay packets towards the device under attack. Now, why is that possible? That's possible because if the victim reinstalls the encryption key, it will also reset the receive replay counter. And the receive replay counter, as the name implies, it's used to detect replays. And if this number is reset, you can replay old frames to the device under attack. So these are the two general consequences of a key reinstallation attack. Now, the impact of the attack is quite tricky to describe because it depends on a lot of factors. So I'm now going to discuss all these factors. And the first factor is that the impact depends on the specific encryption algorithm that you are using. And the most widely used encryption algorithm in a Wi-Fi network is AES-CCNP. And if this encryption algorithm is used, then the impact is, in a sense, limited to decrypting and replaying frames, and you cannot forge frames. So in a sense, we're lucky that this is the most widely used one, because here the impact is at least a bit limited. Because if you were still using the older WPA2 encryption protocol, then the ability to decrypt frames in turn enables an attacker to recover the authentication key, which here is called the message integrity check key. What this key allows you to do is it would allow you to forge packets that appear to be transmitted by the device under attack. So if you would attack a client, you can forge packets that are sent from the client to the access point. Now, there is also a third encryption algorithm, which is called GCMP, and currently people are trying to market it under the name YGIG, and some expect this algorithm to be adopted at a very high rate. Of course, we'll see what will happen. But the impact of our attack is quite high if GCMP would be used. And the reason the impact is high because not only can we recover the authentication key if GCMP is used, we can use this authentication key in both communication directions. So once we recovered this key, we can forge frames sent from the client to the access point, but also from the access point to the client. So in a sense, we got lucky that GCMP isn't widely used yet, because otherwise the impact would have been higher than it is today. Now, another thing that influences the practical impact of the attack is the specific handshake you are attacking. For example, if we are targeting the group key handshake, in that case, we would be attacking the client. However, we would only be able to replay broadcast on multicast data to the client. So just to be clear here, the group key handshake is used to distribute the key that is used to encrypt broadcast on multicast frames to clients. Now, the reason the impact is quite low for this handshake is because the client is never sending real encrypted broadcast frames. Why is that the case? Well, let's say we have the network shown here, and the client on the left wants to send a broadcast frame. The way this is done on a Wi-Fi network is the client first sends this broadcast data frame as a unicast Wi-Fi frame to the access point. And then the access point broadcasts it as a real Wi-Fi broadcast frame. And the idea is that then all clients connected to the access point will receive this frame. But this implies that the client is never sending actual encrypted broadcast Wi-Fi frames, meaning it will never reuse the nonce when sending broadcast data because, well, it just never sends broadcast frames. However, we can attack the client and reset its replay counter, meaning we are able to replay broadcast data towards the client. However, the ability to replay broadcast data, in practice, the impact of that is usually quite low. However, if you would be attacking the four-way handshake, like I just explained, then we are again attacking the client. And in this case, we can generally replay on decrypt frames. And depending on an encryption algorithm, we might also be able to forge frames. Now, the third handshake we can attack is the FT handshake. As mentioned, this handshake is used when you roam from one access point of a network to the same network but a different access point, and this handshake is to switch very quickly between these two access points. And against this handshake, we are attacking the access point, not the client. And again, the impact is the same as the four-way handshake. We can replay on decrypt frames, and possibly we can forge frames. However, an important remark when you attack the FT handshake is that it's easier to attack, because we no longer need this channel-based man-in-the-middle position to block certain packets from arriving at the destination. As an attacker, we simply need to be near the victim. We need to be able to sniff the packets that the client is transmitting, and then we can simply replay that packet continuously to cause these nonce resets in the access point. So to summarize, when you attack the four-way handshake, you need this channel-based man-in-the-middle attack, but when you attack the FT handshake, you don't need a man-in-the-middle attack, you simply need to be close to the device, so it's much easier to attack. Now, another element that influences the impact of the attack is the specific implementation you are attacking. For example, if we consider iOS 10 or Windows, then the four-way handshake is not vulnerable because these two operating systems don't really follow the standard. And in particular, they do not accept and process retransmissions of message 3 of the handshake. And as a result, you can't apply the key reinstallation attack. However, I do want to remark here that these two operating systems are vulnerable to the group key handshake attack, which allows you to replay broadcast frames. For some applications, that can be a security issue, but again, the impact is lower than being able to decrypt unicast traffic, of course. One remark here I also want to give is that if you use iOS 11, it does accept retransmissions of message 3, meaning the four-way handshake is vulnerable, at least if you use an unpatched iOS 10 device. Now, against Linux, we also found a very interesting flaw. Namely, if you use the Wi-Fi client on Linux, which is called WPA supplicant, and in particular, if you use version 2.4 or higher, then instead of reinstalling the key, it will install an all-zero encryption key. And then, of course, all your security is gone. Now, how is it possible that this client is installing an all-zero encryption key? I mean, you're probably thinking, why on earth are they doing that? Well, to explain this, let's again use a scenario where the client, in this case the Android, is connecting to the access point on the right. And in this case, we're going to zoom in a bit on the Android device, and we're going to look at the two components that implement Wi-Fi. We have first here on the left WPA supplicant, which implements the four-way handshake. And we also have the kernel, in this case Linux, which will take the negotiated encryption key and will use it to encrypt data frames. And the way the attack now works to cause Android or Linux into using this all-zero encryption key is that we again assume that we have a man-in-the-middle position. So again, as an attacker, you're able to block packets. And similar to a normal key reinstallation attack, we execute the first part of the four-way handshake without any modification. We simply forward the frames. However, the attacker does not forward message 4 to the access point, which is completely the same idea as when attacking the four-way handshake, in a normal situation. Now, the particular thing that WPA supplicant on Linux does is that after receiving message 3 and sending message 4, it will command the Linux kernel into installing the negotiated encryption key. And the Linux kernel, in turn, will instruct the driver to save this encryption key so the driver can then start encrypting data frames. Now, this means that the encryption key is stored in the driver. And WPA supplicant no longer needs to keep track of this encryption key, so it will clear it from memory. And it will set this buffer where the encryption key is saved to all zeros. So if we now continue with the handshake, and well, with the attack, and if the access point now retransmits message 3, then WPA supplicant will accept this message, it will reply using message 4, and then it will try to reinstall the key. And it will instruct the Linux kernel into saying, hey, please install this encryption key, and this encryption key is saved at this buffer in my memory. But of course, that buffer has been cleared. It's all zeros. So now it's instructing the Linux kernel to install an all-zero key, and of course, once you're using an all-zero key, you can intercept all data that the client is transmitting, and you can also send any data to the client that you want. So at this point, you may be wondering, like, is my device affected? And you can use the scripts at the following URL to test if your device is affected by an attack. You can use these scripts to test both client devices and also access points. And I personally tested this on Kali Linux, so it works on, for example, a virtual machine. Now, I do advise you to use a Wi-Fi dongle that we tested or someone else has successfully used, because sometimes the hardware encryption of the Wi-Fi dongle might interfere with our test script. So if you use these scripts, try to disable hardware encryption and use a Wi-Fi dongle that we tested, because otherwise these scripts might not be reliable. And one thing you're likely going to notice is when you are going to test if devices are affected is that some clients will still be affected. And they will also be affected in half a year, on a year, because they don't get updates. Luckily, we can try to mitigate this problem somewhat. In particular, we can modify the access point so that clients that are connected to such a modified access point are not vulnerable to the most serious attacks that we discovered. In particular, if we modify an access point such that it no longer retransmits message 3 and that it doesn't retransmit the first message of the group key handshake, then any client that is connected to such a modified access point can no longer be attacked against the four-way and group key handshake. Now, even though this works, it's a bit unclear what the impact on practice is about this modification, because it might make the handshake a bit more unclear, for example, when there's a lot of noise and frames are lost. And of course, it's still the case that if your vulnerable device is connected to an access point that doesn't implement these extra modifications, then it of course can still be attacked. But for example, if you're a hospital and you can't update your client devices, then modifying your access point in this way is one option to greatly reduce the impacts of our findings. Okay, so When I was reading the internet about my research, I discovered a lot of misconceptions and discussions about the attack, so I'm going to discuss a few that I encountered. And one of the first misconceptions that I saw is that it was claimed that you only have to update the client or the access point. Now, of course, if your access point implements these extra modifications that I just mentioned, then you can get away with only updating the access point. However, most updates of Wi-Fi access points simply fix the flaws in the access point, and they don't include these extra countermeasures. So in general, you need to update both your access point and your client if they are vulnerable. Another remark that is often made is, yeah, it's a nice attack, but you need to be physically close to the victim on the network in order to pull off this attack. But that's not really the case, because we can use special antenna to be able to manipulate a Wi-Fi network that is quite far away. For example, researchers have shown that they can connect to a network that is up to 2 miles away. And if we looked at leaked NSA documents of Snowden, then the NSA also made their own custom antenna, and in their slides they mentioned that they were able to attack a Wi-Fi network up to 8 miles away. Of course, they had a clear line of sight, but if the NSA can do it 8 miles, we can surely do 2 miles. Another misconception that I heard is that as the attacker, you need to be able to connect to the network yourself. You need to be somehow associated to the network you're trying to attack, which in practice would mean you have the password of the network. But this is not the case. You don't need to know anything about the network. You simply need to be close enough to the victim and to the access point, and then you can carry out the attack. So, another important remark is that you might say that, okay, you can decrypt data frames that are sent right after the four-way handshake, but in general, when you just connect it to a network, your device isn't really sending interesting traffic. I mean, it's sending ARP requests, it's sending DHCP packets, but there is no useful data at that point of the connection. However, what we can do is we can first let the victim connect to the access point. The victim will start surfing the internet, and at that point, when it's already actively connected to the internet, when it has open TCP connections, what we can do then is we can deauthenticate the Wi-Fi client from the network, and then all operating systems will immediately try to perform a new four-way handshake. And this four-way handshake is performed while the TCP connections are still open and running. And in this case, the four-way handshake then completes, and immediately after that, the client will send any queued data of these TCP connections, and we can use that to then decrypt interesting data frames. So, to summarize, we can trigger these four-way handshakes whenever we expect the client to send interesting data. Another misconception is that if you attack the four-way handshake, you need to obtain this special channel-based man-in-the-middle position. And you might say, yeah, but that might be hard to do, because in order to trick the client into attacking your rogue access point, you need to have a high signal strength. However, there's a way to work around this, because as an attacker, we can send special channel switch announcements, which force the client into connecting to the access point on a different channel. So we can basically instruct your device, hey, I'm the access point, I'm now on this different channel, and you need to use this different channel. So we can send the special frames to command the client into connecting to a rogue access point, and this does not rely on the signal strength that we as an attacker have. Now, another remark is that, okay, implementing these attacks is hard, and I can agree with that. You do need to have some background in order to implement these attacks, but once you have written the script, well, then you can just execute the script and everyone can perform the attack. It's the same with a tricky 0J or a tricky buffer overflow. Yeah, it can be time-consuming to write, but once it's written, you can just execute the script and start carrying out attacks. Then some final misconceptions, and I personally found these the most strange ones, is that I sometimes read that, yeah, if you use AES-CCMP, then you don't really need to worry. But as I explained, if you use AES-CCMP, it's still possible to decrypt frames onto replay frames. The only thing that is not possible if you use AES-CCMP is to forge packets. Another remark is that enterprise networks, so those that use 802.1x authentication, for example, with a username and a password, that they aren't affected. But that's not the case because in practice, every protected Wi-Fi network is affected because all of them at one point when connecting to the network, they will use the four-way handshake, meaning they can be attacked. Now, then there are also other people who say, wow, this is very serious, this is the end of the world, but let's not get carried away. Yes, this is a serious vulnerability. It is also very surprising because we had these formal proofs, yet now it's still vulnerable. I think that's the most interesting part really about this work. These protocols were mathematically proven to be secure, yet we still found an attack. So yeah, we have to patch this, but let's also not get carried away with saying that this is the end of the world. It's not. So, as the final part of the presentation, I'm going to discuss a few lessons that we can learn from this research. And, well, I already mentioned the first one, is that the four-way handshake was proven to be secure, and the encryption protocol after it, in particular AES-CCMP, that has also been proven to be secure. But interestingly, when we combine both of these technologies, then things go wrong. And what goes wrong is that this encryption protocol, its precondition is that a particular nonce value should only be used once. However, when you combine the encryption protocol with the four-way handshake, then we can void this assumption and cause this nonce value, this packet number, to be reused, meaning the proof of the encryption protocol no longer applies. Another remark regarding these formal proofs is that a different way to look at it is that the proof of the four-way handshake did not model these retransmissions of message 3 of the handshake. So you can also say that the abstract model that was used in these proofs didn't really reflect reality. And there's a nice quote describing this by Einstein, where he said, in theory and practice are the same, which in this case you interpret as, yeah, it's been proven correct, so surely in practice we're secure as well. But of course, we as hackers know that in practice things can always still go wrong, as we have shown here. Now, a second lesson that we can learn from this research is that we should keep protocols and implementations simple, because they are easy to mess up. And one example is that during the research, we studied version 2.6 of WPA supplicant, and we thought that it wasn't vulnerable to an attack against a four-way handshake. But it turned out that once we were notifying companies, someone did find a method to exploit WPA supplicant 2.6. So the lesson here is even we didn't immediately find this attack. So really, it's just very hard to sometimes manually audit programs, and the way to address this ideally would be to formally verify implementations, or at least important parts such as a crypto implementation. Another example here is that another vulnerability that was discovered is that when the four-way handshake is used to rekey the session key, then we found that host APD, which is the access point used, an open source access point, then it reused the previous anons value. And we also discovered a popular client. I'm not going to name them yet because I think they still have to patch it. They also reuse the snonce, so the supplicant random number. And recall, the anons and the snonce, they are the random numbers that are combined with this pre-shared key to derive a unique session key. Now, of course, if during your rekey you are both using exactly the same random number as before, then you will renegotiate exactly the same key, meaning you will again have key reuse. So this is actually quite a strange situation because Normally, people recommend to regularly rekey your session key because this is supposed to make attacks harder. However, if you have a vulnerable implementation, then it might actually reduce your security. For example, if you use this client with host APD, then you should not be rekeying your session key. And interestingly, in documents that are leaked by WikiLeaks, in particular a certain CIA document, there they also warn that rekeying functionality introduces unnecessary complexity, and therefore this might introduce bugs. And this matches very well with what we just found. We found that if you try to add features to a protocol, for example, efficient rekeying functionality, well, that increases the complexity of the protocol, it increases the complexity of the code, and that can lead to vulnerability. So the lesson here is keep your protocols simple and keep your implementation simple as well. And finally, the last lesson that we can learn is that the specifications and the standards that we use, they need to be sufficiently rigorous. In particular, if you look at the early version of the WPA2 standard, then the state machine which describes how the Wi-Fi client is supposed to be implemented, it doesn't really define when messages are accepted. You simply have this kind of pseudocode. Now, you don't need to be able to read this, but basically this code says that what should happen if you receive a particular message, but it does not say when a particular message is supposed to be accepted or not. And in practice, we see that iOS 10 and Windows indeed don't accept retransmissions of message 3. Now, I can forgive them a bit because the standard was unclear. If you look at an amendment to the Wi-Fi standard, we can see that it now better defines the state machine. We now have this block diagram here on the right, which better shows the steps that have to be walked through. So it's more clear when certain messages have to be accepted. But still, if you look at it, some terms and cases are still a bit unclear. Okay, so before I finish the talk, I want to make one last remark. If there are people, if there are university people, researcher in this audience, and if you are working on security protocols, then consider submitting your work to this conference. It is specifically aimed to testing the security of security protocols implementation. So if you work in academia, look up this workshop. With that, I conclude the talk. Thank you all for attending, and if you have questions, feel free to ask.
Hi there, from the back. I have a quick question. We found out yesterday that Apple just, in the past week in iOS 11.2, patched this vulnerability for devices other than the iPhone 10 or the iPad Pro. Any thoughts on why it might have taken so long? Like you said, iOS 11 had some vulnerabilities. I don't know why it has taken so long. Maybe they use a different implementation, because I do know the difference between iOS 10 and 11 is that iOS 10 doesn't accept retransmissions of message 3, while iOS 11 does. So maybe there are some implementation issues that the code is different. But of course, I don't know the details about the code that Apple is using. So.
Hi, I just wanted to clear up. So in the normal situation of the four-way handshake, message 4 sent by the client to the access point is unencrypted. That's before the installation of the key, right?
Yes, so normally message 4 should be sent unencrypted.
Yeah, and then when the attacker who's in the middle blocks a message 4, and then the second time message 4 is sent, that's encrypted. Isn't that unexpected from the point of view of the AP? How does the AP handle this encrypted message 4?
That is indeed unexpected, because the Wi-Fi standard, if you read it very carefully, says that message 4 should always be sent unencrypted. However, we found that nearly all implementations will send it in an encrypted way. And when the access point receives this encrypted message, it will just drop it because the access point hasn't yet installed the key, meaning eventually the handshake will time out. So that's actually a reliability problem in implementations.
And to prevent the access point from dropping it, could the attacker maybe block this message as well, and then after, can it replay the previous unencrypted frame that it had blocked, or is that not possible?
So you're asking whether it can replay the first message 4?
Yeah, that was initially blocked.
Yes, so that depends on the specific access point implementation. For example, the open source host APD access point, if you then forward this old message 4, then it will accept it. However, other access points will no longer accept this older message 4 because they only accept the most recent one.
Okay.
So it depends on implementation.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
Hey, thank you for the great talk. I have a quick question. If we patch all access points, which no longer transmit the message 3, why should I also patch my client?
So, of course, if you are somehow able to patch every access point that exists, then you reduce the impact of the attack, but it's still possible to, under certain special cases, attack the group key handshake, so you would still be able to sometimes replay broadcast on multicast frames. So of course, if you live in an ideal world and you can patch every access point, then yeah, you can greatly reduce the impact of the attack, but in practice that's not an option.
But for handshake is no longer concerned.
If you patch the access point and your client is connected to the patched access point, you can no longer attack the four-way handshake. Okay. And you can't attack the group key handshake. However, there are other ways to still mess with the group key. But the four-way handshake is safe then.
Oh, okay, thank you.
No more questions? No? Okay. Again, thank you for attending the talk.